So welcome back again this week. You know, a funny thing happened at the Judiciary Committee meeting in the Senate of the United States last week. They held up a very interesting chart relative to terrorists and monitoring terrorism and everything else. And they had the world divided into 4 regions relative to terrorist events. And they were Asia, Europe, Africa, but interestingly enough, they referred to the Homeland area, which is on this map, thinking of Homeland Security, of Mexico, the United States, and Canada. For those of you who remember the fight to stop the North American Union, and what they talked about was instituting a 3-nation strategy relative to having a common border, that the military and the police would work together in these 3 countries together with no borders in between the 3 countries. In other words, our southern border would be gone between Mexico, and our northern border would be gone between Canada. But then it kind of shows up once in a while that they still have this plan in mind, that this will be a common security border with military and police. Now, in addition to that, they were also going to integrate the banking, the environment, the health care, and everything else of those countries, all the while professing that they weren't going to merge these countries into one. They were just going to be a community. But in the process, you can't have the health care programs, the police, the armed forces, the banking, the environmental laws, et cetera, all merged unless it's a new country. It doesn't work. So anyway, they still have that in mind. But you see, it's still in place to, the worry about terrorism because of Al-Qaeda. And here's the Sunday mornings, or Monday morning, actually, of the Wall Street Journal. Regrouped Al-Qaeda poses global threat. So at one time, Al-Qaeda was a small ragtag group. We were told they're in Afghanistan. Oh no, they're in Iraq. Oh yeah, they're in Afghanistan. Yemen, let's see, Libya, etc., Syria. And we find that Al-Qaeda has actually grown. It didn't even exist in Iraq before we went in there. That was a story that was given us by our federal government. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Saddam Hussein did not cooperate with Al-Qaeda. Saddam Hussein was a terrible individual, and as is Al-Qaeda. But they weren't working together. And Al-Qaeda didn't get into Iraq until we arrived. And by the way, I don't know if you've noticed it, but a lot of the things that we've lent out and contracted for to be done, we've actually contracted to Al-Qaeda organizations. This was in the news just last week. We find, too, that we've actually armed Al-Qaeda in some areas. Oh, we don't do it directly. In Libya, apparently we did, but in Syria, we're giving it to this group, and then that group gives it to Al-Qaeda. So, on one hand, we're saying that we've got a war against Al-Qaeda and terrorism in general. On the other hand, we're giving them contracts. We're giving them either directly or indirectly weapons. Apparently, this Benghazi affair had a lot to do with gun running into such terrorist organizations as Al-Qaeda and others. And that's why it blew up in our face. That's what the evidence is increasingly showing. But at any rate, we've got on one hand a war against them, and on the other hand, we're helping them. It doesn't make sense. It's World War II repeated all over again. For those of you who don't know it, there was a lot of help from the United States and England to help build the Nazis in Germany. We have a propensity of building our own enemies. We did it with Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. We did it with Mao Zedong in China. We did it with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And now we're doing it with Al-Qaeda. One hand says this, the other hand says that. But it's from the same government. So you have to ask a question, what is going on? And what is going on, bottom line, ultimately, is control over the American people. That's what the war on terror is being used for, ultimately. and control in some of these other countries as well, changing governments, getting the governments that organizations like the Council on Foreign Relations want, not what the people necessarily want, like in Egypt and other places. It's pretty bad, really. I don't know how many of you noticed that the New York Times sold last week the Boston Globe newspaper. And it's kind of interesting because a decade ago, they bought in 1993, actually it's two decades ago, the New York Times bought the Boston Globe for $1.1 billion. Last week they sold it for $70 million. That's a 93% loss. Now, if you factor in inflation, it even makes it worse. And what has happened over the years is that in the last, well, just about a decade, the Boston Globe has lost 1/2 of its circulation. People don't read it anymore like they used to. They used to have well over about 500,000 readers. Today they have just a little over 200,000 main circulation. In addition to that, the New York Times has reported its 11th straight quarter of falling ad revenue. In other words, they're losing money in their advertising for 11th straight quarter. That's a long time. It's indicative of the problem that the newspapers are having for a variety of reasons. One is obviously the internet. People can get their news off the internet. But in addition to that, people are getting tired of reading what's in these newspapers. The obvious slant. Anyone who reads the New York Times knows that there's a liberal, socialist slant to everything they do. They always put out in the middle of an article, not the middle, at the beginning of an article, to tug at your heartstrings to prepare you for the article that they're going to give you. They will bring out a woman and her children, a single mom, and tug at your heartstrings about how terrible this woman is. She's not terrible, but the condition that she lives in is terrible because she's trying to raise these kids. She can't hold down a job because daycare costs too much. And then it evolves into where the government's cutting back on welfare. See, so they set you up before they even tell you the facts in the news, so that your heart will go one way instead of your logic saying, wait a minute, government can't sustain this kind of thing. And speaking of that, we see increasingly articles talking about Detroit and other areas sloughing off their health care programs to the federal government under Obamacare. Here's one, for instance. This was Monday last. Detroit looks to health law to ease costs. Now, I may have mentioned this before, but Detroit owes $5.7 billion in retiree health costs. They're going to slough that off over to Obamacare. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of money. And then, here's one that occurred today. It says health care law raises pressure on public unions. So what we see is that in cities and towns across the country that have municipal unions, that have health care programs, they're going to start now sloughing this off to Obamacare, to these various, under the Cadillac program. And so originally we were told there were 30 million people in this country who didn't have health insurance. And we needed to do something about that, without mentioning the fact that if they can't afford health care, who's going to afford it for them? It's the taxpayer, somewhere along the line, that will pay and foot the bill for these 30 million. Well, now we see that the cities can no longer afford health care, and the unions can no longer afford health care, so they too will start to slough this off on Obamacare. And how much do you think that's going to cost? All the original projections that the Obama used to convince us that that program would work, we find now are off by double to triple the amount. With this revelation, that will quadruple and quintuple. And you're going to start seeing businesses just folding up. They can't afford this sort of thing. People can't afford this kind of thing. What are they going to do? They're going to go to government for it, particularly public unions. Millions of public employees will be pressuring Congress not only wipe out Obamacare, but to even supplement it, to come out with a single-payer program where everybody's on the same program, courtesy of the government, and watch your taxes go up. It's going to be bad unless we stop it now. Until next week, we'll see you then.